A single severed oil line decided the tactical future of the Pacific theater. On June 4, 1942, a Mitsubishi Zero fighter operating over Dutch Harbor, Alaska, took a fatal hit from defensive fire. The bullet did not strike the pilot or the fuel tanks. It severed the return oil line between the oil cooler and the engine. This is the mechanism of a slow, irreversible failure. Without oil pressure, the 14-cylinder Nakajima engine would seize within minutes. The pilot, 19-year-old Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga, faced a binary choice dictated by fluid dynamics. He could climb and attempt to return to his carrier, a flight that would end in engine failure over the freezing Bering Sea, or he could divert to the designated emergency landing point 25 miles to the east. Koga chose the diversion. He turned his aircraft tailcode DI-108 toward Akutan Island. This decision began a chain of events that would deliver the Imperial Navy's most guarded technological secret directly into the hands of United States intelligence. The objective of this recovery investigation is to understand how a sequence of 3 mechanical and procedural decisions preserved the airframe while killing the pilot. The constraints were absolute. The oil was draining, the engine temperature was rising. The terrain below was a deceptive mix of volcanic rock and biological traps. The aircraft arrived over Akutan Island trailing oil. Koga approached the Broad Bight Valley, a flat expanse of green terrain nestled between volcanic slopes. From an altitude of 500 feet, the valley floor appeared to be solid, manicured grass. It was a visual error. The surface was muskeg, green from altitude, liquid under load. In uncertain terrain, the safer choice is a belly landing. By retracting the landing gear, a pilot increases the surface area of the impact, allowing the fuselage to slide along the ground and dissipate kinetic energy through friction. This procedure protects the pilot but often destroys the propeller and the underside of the airframe. Koga made a fatal procedural error. He kept the landing gear down. It is possible he believed the ground was firm enough to allow a conventional rollout, which would save the aircraft for a later recovery by Japanese submarine crews. The physics of the touchdown were instantaneous and violent. The moment the main wheels touched the green surface, they did not roll. They sliced through the vegetation and locked into the heavy mud beneath. The landing gear acted as a fulcrum. The aircraft's center of mass was high and forward of the wheels. With the wheels immobilized by the muskeg, the 3-ton airframe retained its forward momentum. It rotated around the axle line. The tail lifted and the machine flipped upside down in a fraction of a second. The vertical stabilizer crushed into the mud. The cockpit canopy slammed into the bog, shattering the plexiglass and driving the structure down into the soft soil. The energy of the impact was not absorbed by a long slide. It was absorbed by the airframe flipping and the pilot's body. Tadayoshi Koga was killed on impact, his neck breaking in the rollover. The aircraft came to rest inverted, its belly pointing at the sky, mostly intact. The preservation was accidental and total. The same mud that killed the pilot cushioned the machine. The fuselage did not buckle. The fuel tanks did not rupture. The fire boundary was never crossed because the engine was starved of oil and cooled by the wet bog. The final link in this chain of preservation involved the wingmen. 2 other Zero fighters circled the crash site. Their standing orders were clear. If a Zero lands in enemy territory and cannot be recovered, it must be destroyed to protect its design secrets. The standard procedure was to strafe the wreck until it burned. The wingmen descended and observed the inverted plane. They saw no movement. They could not verify if Koga was dead or merely unconscious. They faced a psychological and procedural constraint. They could not bring themselves to fire on their flight leader without confirmation of his death. After circling, they departed, leaving the airframe whole. They assumed the remote location and the masking terrain would keep the secret safe. They were wrong. The aircraft lay upside down in a suction field of living ground. Akutan's defining feature was muskeg. To a pilot observing from altitude, it reads as solid turf, suitable for a rollout. In terms of physics, it functions closer to a high-viscosity fluid. Muskeg is a deep accumulation of decaying vegetation, sphagnum moss, and water-saturated soil that has built up over centuries. It possesses a unique structural property. It cannot support a concentrated point load such as a tire, but it serves as an excellent shock absorber for a distributed load such as a wing or a fuselage. This specific soil mechanics distinction is a major reason the aircraft survived the impact. When the landing gear struts entered this medium, the deceleration was not gradual. The wheels encountered resistance comparable to hitting a low wall. The kinetic energy of the 5,500-pound aircraft did not vanish. It transferred into rotational torque. The airframe pivoted around the locked wheels. The tail section described a 180-degree arc through the air. The physics of this rollover usually results in the catastrophic failure of the main wing spars or the crushing of the vertical stabilizer. In a standard soil impact, the metal structure would buckle under the sudden load. Here, the muskeg acted as a hydraulic damper. As the inverted aircraft slammed into the bog, the ground did not resist with the hardness of concrete or the density of sand. It displaced. The semi-liquid mud molded itself around the aluminum skin of the wings and the cowling. It distributed the impact energy across the entire upper surface of the aircraft. This prevented the localized stress concentrations that snap metal. The wings remained attached. The fuselage structure remained true. The delicate tail control surfaces were pressed into the grass but not sheared off. This energy absorption was so efficient that it preserved the most fragile rotating components. In a typical nose-over crash, the propeller blades strike the ground and bend backward into unrecognizable shapes, often shattering the reduction gear housing. In the Akutan bog, the 3 aluminum blades sliced into the soft mud like knives. They suffered so little damage that they were later dressed with a file and reused on the aircraft during flight testing. This is a fringe technical detail that emphasizes the softness of the trap. The propeller, a precision component spinning at low RPM during the landing flare, survived a direct vertical impact with the planet. However, the energy calculation was different for the pilot. The aircraft structure is rigid, but the human body is articulated. When the canopy struck the mud, it drove the aircraft partially underground. The deceleration spike was instantaneous. The pilot was strapped into his seat, but his head was free to move. The whiplash effect snapped his neck. The mud filled the cockpit instantly, suffocating any potential for survival if the trauma had not been fatal. The mechanism that saved the machine was the exact mechanism that killed the operator. The mud cushioned the aluminum but suffocated the man. The location of the wreck further complicated the equation. The aircraft came to rest 0.5 miles inland from the shoreline of Broad Bight. It was not visible from the beach. The tall marsh grass of the Aleutians, which grows up to 3 feet high, immediately obscured the inverted belly of the fighter. From the air, the camouflage paint of the Zero blended with the green and brown texture of the bog. From the sea, it was shielded by the slight rise of the valley floor. The wreck began to settle. The heavy engine block weighed down the nose, sinking deeper into the water table. The bog created a chemically distinct environment. The water was cold and likely low in oxygen due to the decaying vegetation, which slowed the immediate onset of heavy corrosion. The aircraft was now a time capsule, locked in a cold, wet stasis. It held the answers to the Zero's climb rate and its maneuverability limits, but it was encased in a slurry that no vehicle could drive over. The energy of the crash had dissipated, leaving a static, heavy object roughly half a mile from accessible water, hidden in a fog bank that rarely lifted. History often categorizes the discovery of the Akutan Zero as an act of pure luck. A forensic examination of the flight path suggests it was the statistical consequence of a navigation deviation. On July 10, 1942, a PBY Catalina patrol bomber commanded by Lieutenant William Thies was returning to Dutch Harbor after a standard patrol. The operational environment of the Aleutian Islands is defined by a single, overwhelming variable, which is visibility. The fog does not sit static. It moves in banks that can obscure a mountain range in minutes. In this environment, standard visual search patterns are often impossible. The concept of search grid logic usually dictates a creeping line-ahead pattern, where an aircraft flies long, parallel tracks to cover a rectangular ocean segment with overlapping sensor sweeps. In 1942, the primary sensor was the human eye, aided by binoculars. The limitation of this system is the slant range visibility. If the fog ceiling drops below 500 feet, the search box effectively collapses to zero. A pilot cannot scan a grid if he cannot see the surface. Lieutenant Thies was not flying a search grid. He was flying a transit leg. He had lost visual reference with the ground due to a shifting wind that altered his dead reckoning track. To correct his position, he needed a hard landmark. This procedural requirement forced him to deviate from his direct return path and drop altitude over Akutan Island, looking for a coastline or a peak to reset his navigation solution. As the PBY descended, the aircraft passed through a temporary break in the cloud layer. This was not a cleared sky, but a vertical tunnel in the overcast. Thies looked down. At the bottom of this momentary visual window, he saw a disruption in the green texture of the valley floor. It was a man-made shape with a distinct geometric outline that did not match the geology of the bog. The object was the inverted Mitsubishi Zero. The camouflage paint had merged with the grass, but the bright red Hinomaru insignias on the underside of the wings remained visible against the green muskeg. These red circles acted as high-contrast optical beacons. If the aircraft had landed right side up, the dark green upper surfaces might have remained camouflaged indefinitely. The inversion of the airframe, caused by the landing gear failure, ironically made the wreckage visible from the air. Thies circled the site. He verified the silhouette. It was a single engine fighter, lying belly up. There was no smoke, indicating the crash was cold. There was no movement, indicating the pilot was either dead or gone. The position was approximately 25 miles from Dutch Harbor, well within the range of a recovery operation. The discovery changed the status of the asset from a rumor to a verified target. However, finding the coordinates was only the first step in the acquisition chain. The crew took photographs to prove the find, but they could not land the heavy flying boat in the marsh. They marked the map coordinates and returned to base. The intelligence value of the find was immediate. A verified, intact airframe offered a direct look into the enemy's engineering philosophy. But the location presented a new set of constraints. The aircraft was not on a runway or a beach. It was trapped in muskeg, terrain that could not support vehicles. The problem was now heavy lift. They had bounded the search box, but they had no established method to extract a 3-ton deadweight from a suction trap without destroying the structure they intended to save. The recovery problem was no longer intelligence, it was geometry. An inverted fighter trapped in muskeg, boxed in by hills that denied heavy airlift. There were no roads, no cranes, and no hardstand surfaces. The team faced a structural paradox. They needed to lift a 5,000-pound airframe vertically out of the suction of the mud without bending the fuselage or snapping the wing spars. Any attempt to roll the aircraft over while it was still embedded in the ground would have destroyed the vertical stabilizer and crushed the delicate tail section. The first step in the handling plan was the removal of the pilot. The cockpit canopy had been driven deep into the muskeg by the force of the impact. The fuselage was compressed against the earth, leaving almost no clearance for entry. This created an access constraint that ruled out standard tools. The team could not simply open the canopy. They had to send a man inside the crushed space to physically detach the pilot from the airframe. This task fell to machinist mate Albert Knack. He was selected not for his rank but for his physical dimensions. As the smallest man on the recovery detail, Knack was the only one who could fit through the narrow gap between the fuselage and the mud. He crawled into the inverted cockpit, working in confined darkness against the ceiling of the bog. His objective was procedural. He cut the safety harness that held Tadayoshi Koga's body. He then attached a line to the pilot, allowing the team outside to extract the remains. The body was buried nearby, clearing the aircraft for technical recovery. With the human element resolved, the team addressed the physics of the lift. They constructed a wooden tripod derrick using heavy timbers scavenged and brought to the site. Tripod lift geometry is a foundational mechanical concept for field recovery. It relies on distributing the load across 3 distinct points of contact. By joining 3 beams at a central apex and suspending a block and tackle system from that center, the weight of the aircraft is converted into compressive force traveling down the legs. This converts a vertical lifting problem into a structural stability problem. The advantage of a tripod is that it is self-stabilizing and requires no external power source, only manual labor to work the chain hoist. However, this system assumes the ground can generate an equal and opposite reaction to the downward force of the legs. On Akutan Island, the ground failed. As the team began to hoist the Zero, the weight of the engine and fuselage transferred to the tripod legs. The muskeg could not support the concentrated point loads. Instead of the aircraft rising, the tripod sank. The wooden timbers drove 3 to 4 feet deep into the water-saturated soil. The recovery engineers had to stop, reset, and reinforce the base of the legs to increase the surface area and reduce the ground pressure. It was a slow, iterative process of fighting the soil mechanics. Every foot of lift required a readjustment of the geometry. The suction of the mud on the wings added to the effective weight of the load, requiring force well beyond the dry weight of the aircraft. Slowly, the fuselage broke free from the vacuum of the bog. The team lifted it high enough to clear the surface, but they did not flip it immediately. Flipping a suspended aircraft requires precise control of the center of gravity to prevent it from swinging violently and striking the support legs. They stabilized the load and prepared for the next phase of the operation. The aircraft was now suspended in the air, dripping with mud, but it was still miles from the ocean. The lift only changed the problem's axis. Now they had to translate a suspended prize across ground that could not be driven on. The recovery team had successfully separated the aircraft from the earth, but they now faced a kinetic risk constraint. The wreckage was located half a mile from the shoreline. The intervening terrain was the same water-saturated muskeg that had trapped the landing gear during the crash. Using a standard wheeled trailer was physically impossible. Wheels concentrate the total load of the cargo onto small contact patches at the base of the tires. In soft soil, this high ground pressure causes the wheels to cut through the surface mat and sink, immobilizing the vehicle and subjecting the airframe to sudden shock loads that could fracture the aluminum spars. To traverse the bog, the engineers had to reject rolling motion in favor of sliding friction. This is the mechanical principle of skid transport. A skid is a simple, flat-bottomed wooden sled. It functions by distributing the 5,500-pound weight of the aircraft across a massive surface area. By drastically increasing the square footage of ground contact, the pounds per square inch exerted on the mud drops below the soil's failure threshold. The liquid mud, which was an enemy to the landing gear, becomes a lubricant for the sled. The team constructed a heavy wooden skid under the suspended fuselage. They carefully lowered the Zero onto the cradle, securing it with ropes to prevent shifting. A tractor, likely a light crawler type, capable of operating on the marsh crust, was attached to the front of the sled. The process was slow and linear. The tractor dragged the sled over the vegetation, sliding the prize toward the ocean. This method eliminated the vibration and bouncing associated with wheeled transport, protecting the internal avionics and the engine mounts from further damage. Upon reaching the beach at Broad Bight, the logistics shifted from terrain management to security management. The aircraft was loaded onto a barge for transfer to the transport ship, the USS St. Mihiel. At this stage, the operation moved from a salvage context to a counterintelligence context. The Zero was not merely damaged equipment. It was the highest value technological asset in the Pacific theater. To protect the integrity of the find, the team executed a deception measure. While on the barge and during subsequent transport, the aircraft was disguised. Standard procedure for high-value foreign materiel often involves covering the silhouette with tarpaulins or constructing false crates to hide the distinctive shape of the wings and tail. This was done to prevent unauthorized photography, souvenir hunting by Allied personnel, and observation by any potential observers. The goal was to ensure the aircraft arrived at the research facility with every gauge, switch, and control surface exactly as Tadayoshi Koga left them. The journey followed a strict chain of custody. The fuselage was shipped south to Seattle, Washington, arriving on August 1st. From there, it was moved by barge to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. The arrival in California marked the decisive technical pivot of the entire operation. The recovery phase was complete, the mud was washed away, and the structural repairs began. The outcome path was now locked. The United States Navy did not just have a wreck, they had a flyable machine. The question changed from how to lift it to how to defeat it. The engineers and test pilots at North Island prepared to enter the cockpit and systematically dismantle the myth of the Zero's invincibility through physics and flight testing. 200 knots. This specific airspeed number became the hard boundary of the Imperial Navy's air superiority. Before the recovery of the Akutan Zero, the performance limits of the Mitsubishi A6M2 were a matter of speculation and fear. After the recovery, they were a matter of engineering data. At Naval Air Station North Island, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders began a systematic flight test program that converted the enemy's reputation into a series of mechanical charts. The primary revelation concerned the control surfaces. The Zero was famous for its low-speed agility, allowing it to turn inside any American fighter of 1942. However, Sanders discovered that this advantage evaporated as the aircraft accelerated. The concept of aileron freeze dictated the engagement rules. The A6M2 utilized very large ailerons to achieve high maneuverability. Sanders found that above 200 knots, the ailerons began to freeze up. Rolling maneuvers became slow and demanded heavy force on the stick. The aircraft stiffened, it lost its ability to roll quickly. This meant that at high combat speeds, the Zero became sluggish, while American fighters, which used hydraulic boosting or different hinge moments, retained their roll rate. The second critical flaw was located in the fuel system. The Nakajima Sakai engine, rated at 940 horsepower, utilized a float-style carburetor. Sanders documented that under negative acceleration, the engine could cut out, a consequence of its float-type carburetor. The engine would sputter or quit entirely until positive gravity was restored. These two mechanical facts created a new tactical doctrine. The data was disseminated to every squadron in the Pacific. The instructions were procedural. Never dogfight a Zero at low speed. Keep the energy high. If a Zero is on your tail, do not climb. Instead, push the nose over into a steep dive. The Zero's engine will cut out, causing it to lose distance. Then execute a hard right roll at high speed. The Zero pilot, fighting aileron freeze, physically cannot follow the maneuver. The American pilot escapes or reverses the position. The mystery of the Zero was replaced by a physics equation that American pilots could exploit. The Akutan Zero served as a test platform and a training adversary for the remainder of the war. Its end was not in combat, but in a ground accident. In February 1945, as the war in the Pacific neared its conclusion, the aircraft was taxiing for a takeoff at North Island. A Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver lost control while taxiing. The Helldiver's propeller impacted the Zero, shredding the fuselage and severing the tail. The aircraft that had survived the muskeg of Akutan and the shipping process was destroyed by a collision on a friendly airfield. The wreckage was ordered to be scrapped. However, a naval aviator named William Leonard, who had flown against Zeros in combat, happened to be on the scene. In a moment of historical preservation, he salvaged the instrument panel gauges from the debris. This constitutes the final fringe detail of the case. Leonard kept the gauges for decades before donating them to the National Museum of the United States Navy. The legacy of the recovery was absolute. The 19-year-old pilot Tadayoshi Koga died for a mistake in terrain analysis. But his error allowed the United States Navy to dismantle the technological advantage of the Japanese Empire. The victory was not found in the destruction of the airframe in 1945, but in the survival of the thousands of Allied pilots who used Eddie Sanders' data to survive the sky of the Pacific. The operation proved that in a war of machines, the most dangerous weapon is not the fighter itself, but the technical manual that explains how to break it.